Welcome to the Green Urbanist, podcast for urbanists fighting climate change. I'm Ross. Hello and welcome back to another episode. Ross here. Today's episode is a conversation with Alisdair Dixon and McSweeney.
I'm Alisdair. I'm the co-founder of Collective Works. We're a small practice doing our best to engage with the complex world around us and deliver what is hopefully some beautiful and responsible design. I'm also a steering group member with Arkitekter.
Hi, I'm Annalisa. I am the UK Head of Sustainability for White Arkitekter, and together with Alisdair, I'm on the steering group for Arkitekter.
Later in the episode, you'll also hear from Isabel, who is the editor of Arkitekter Today. So the topic of our conversation is the Regenerative Architecture Index. This is being launched at the moment by Arkitekter Today and UK Architects Declare. And the idea of the Regenerative Architecture Index, or the RAI, is that it sets out to benchmark progress in the move towards regenerative practice and projects within architecture and built environment disciplines. So it recognises the need for a built environment that isn't merely reducing the negative impacts, but has positive impacts for today and the long term. It's currently open for submissions until the 17th of May 2024, so do check out the link in the description to the page for the RAI, and do consider submitting your practice or your projects towards it. Those who meet the criteria will be included in a compendium along with case studies, commentary, analysis, and the idea is to really elevate best practice that's happening in the transition to regenerative architecture at the moment. In the episode, we get into a lot more of the details of what has inspired the RAI, what is behind it. We also have a really interesting chat around the criteria for what would be considered regenerative design, which are about being a good ancestor, co-evolving with nature, and creating a just space for people. So really, really interesting stuff and really interesting concepts that we're getting into. So yeah, hope you enjoy. We're going to chat about the Regenerative Architecture Index. So let's jump into that and just tell us what it is. Where did it come from? What's the story behind that?
Great, thanks, Ross. Well, this really came about because of a collaboration between Arkitekter Today and Arkitekts Declare. And it was a guy called Ken, I think, a few years back who made the introductions. And we discovered that we had a lot in common with Arkitekter Today. And certainly their passing the Test of Time award meant something with Arkitekts Declare. And so the idea sort of came about there. And then we've launched it recently, and it's really about pushing towards more regenerative practice. And so that's long been the history of Arkitekts Declare, is to push in the direction of regenerative practice. And so we recognise that it's an ambitious system and an ambitious set of questions. But just like the Arkitekts Declare declaration points, that's really about showing ambition.
Yeah. I suppose quickly, for people who might not be aware, what is regenerative design?
Oh, well, okay, so regenerative design, I think we would firstly say, is a mindset. And I think that's the first thing we need to think about. It's a way of thinking in a non-linear way, as we have done to date, but in a more systematic way, in a way to really understand how over time we can co-evolve with nature and start to repair the damage we've done to our natural ecosystems. And it's, within the Arkitekts Declare primer, which will also the design primer that we'll talk about as well, we've really categorized three main ways of considering regenerative design thinking. So they would be being a good ancestor, and really looking seventh generation thinking. How are the decisions that we're making through design impacting not only ourselves today, but into the future? Co-evolving with nature, as said. So really thinking, we can go into this into more detail, but what is our position within human and living ecosystems? And then creating a just place for people. So really making sure that we bring everyone along board with us, and that we're co-designing, and that we're creating a just and equitable future.
I think that's really good. Let's definitely get into those later on. Jenna, we're planning to do, but I think that aspect of putting a bit more of a bit more structure and guidance around regenerative design, which is a very new term, and I think people struggle to grapple with, as it feels quite conceptual. But looking forward to chatting more about that. But I suppose, let's start with the Regenerative Architecture Index in that sense. So that set us up really well. What is it and what's it trying to achieve, I suppose, as a, in your own words, I suppose.
In my own words. Well, it's really, like I say, it's about encouraging change, and it's also about recognising that sustainability as a paradigm hasn't got us where it needs to, and the two terms actually kind of came about at the same time in the 70s and 80s. There was a huge sort of enlightenment and awakening about the impact of humanity on the planet, and so a lot of these terms, and it was actually regenerative design, and it kind of emerged through agriculture, and regenerative agriculture has kind of existed for much longer than regenerative design has as an idea. But it's really about celebrating people who are in some ways regenerative in their practice, and we know that many practices won't be doing this every day and won't have necessarily hundreds of case studies that really embody regenerative design. But what we do want to do is pull out a handful of places where they are being regenerative. And I think that's the interesting thing about the way the index should hopefully work, is that by asking so many quite deep questions about how people are practicing, we should find some really good practice in some of those areas. And we want to celebrate those people who are really succeeding, whether it's about how they work with nature, how they work with people, or how they are good ancestors. All of these things should hopefully give us the threads of what regenerative practice looks like. And so we'll sort of bring those threads together to present a picture of regenerative practice from all of those different ideas. I don't think it will be one practice that is clearly doing it all, because we know from our work through Arkitekter declare to this point that there isn't one practice that's managed it all, otherwise we will be sort of emulating them.
I think it kind of comes into the bigger goals of Arkitekter declare as well. I mean, I think we realise that today we're operating in a degenerative system, and it's very hard to be regenerative within that system. In order to make change, we also recognise that you have to have a really clear vision. And what we're hoping is that we've maybe miscalled it by naming it an index, because I think that alludes to some sort of hierarchy or ranking. And actually, it's not about that at all. It's about looking at today, what is the best picture of regenerative design that we can find that is setting our vision for the future and that's giving us something to aim towards. And we're hoping that this will be an iterative thing year on year that will build a stronger picture and will kind of shift the boundaries of what's possible and inspire new practice.
That's amazing. You preempted one of my questions that I did want to ask, which was that when I had a look at your questions and your criteria, I thought, wow, this is really... these are really ambitious. I wonder, will there be any practice that actually hits all of them? And you're saying, actually, it's not the point that you're doing everything perfectly now. It's that maybe you're doing really well on some things, and then we can all learn together and sort of raise.
Exactly. And like Annalisa says, that's really the emphasis of Arkitekter declare, it to say, here's an ambitious goal, because if we can't be optimistic and look beyond the realism of today, we aren't going to, have a thriving future. So it's finding those sort of green shoots across the profession, because we know that there's great practice going on. And I think the other thing we want to say about the Regenerative Architecture Index is it intends not to benefit or be particularly easier for larger practices who've got more resources to put into these kind of entries. It's really hopefully open to as many practices as possible, because we know that actually there's seeds of regenerative practice a lot more in small practices who are more agile and more nimble, and who would, whether that's how they engage with communities, how they work with and evolve materials, or how they run their office and treat their staff. There's lots of different threads of regenerative practice, and actually it's often the smaller, younger practices who are able to be a bit more nimble and test these things out. So we hope that the larger practices can learn from them and also be seen alongside them. But conversely, the larger practices have more resourcing, more built-up experience, more knowledge banks, more kind of, muscle and heft in order to actually put time into whether that's materials research or particular work that they're doing. So we kind of want to see small and large practices as the same in this index, but really hopefully taking lessons and best practice from them both.
Separately, I caught up with Isabel Allen to learn about the role of architecture today in the Regenerative Architecture Index.
So I think for architecture today, our role obviously at one level is to disseminate, to make the information that comes out accessible, to use our editorial skills to make it engage not only with the converted, but with as wide an audience as we possibly can across architecture and the built environment. I think there's also a sense in which we we stand, or we should stand, for the mainstream. I think, like all magazines that serve a very well-defined professional community, if we don't appeal to at least 99% of them, we're kind of doomed. So actually for us, that's the interesting thing, is you want to use your platform to gently kind of nudge the up the ante, if you like, to nudge the sort of mainstream in a good direction, but you don't want to leave people behind. You don't want to make people feel bad about themselves, or like you don't represent them. So it's a kind of delicate balancing act. And I think, it's an exciting challenge for us. I think it's also, in a way, an opportunity to stop being just an observer and actually try and engender change. And I think, the media that serves, as I say, a tight-knit professional community always struggles with this. And some editors will take the view that your job is just to kind of distill and to reflect and hold up a mirror to the community you serve. And others say, actually, we're going to jump in and we're going to try and do something positive. And I think for us, we've very much nailed our colours to the jumping in mast. But, we have to do it without destroying our credibility and alienating our base. So, but, to me, that doesn't make it any weaker, because actually, I think, we all know, and Arkitekter Declare have very clearly articulated the fact that no progress is really going to happen if there's only a minority behind it. So, to me, that's the challenge, is finding those points where the vast majority of the architectural profession and the built environment are interested enough or intrigued enough or engaged enough to actually want to find out more and up their game. There's so many practices out there doing amazing work, but we absolutely understand that it's work that is very difficult to communicate. And, architecture has a very well-established media, but it's got tropes, if you like, and it's all around the kind of the one-off shiny building or the star architect, whatever it is. And it's not very good at capturing processes or ideas or thinking or structural change or the way you organise your practice or any of these things which we now understand are absolutely essential for progress. But, somehow or other, it seems to me that, this business of sharing information is the most useful thing we can do right now, because that's the biggest sort of heartbreak, really, is you speak to so many people and there's so much work, but it's we're reinventing the wheel, we're not making iterative progress. So I think that feels like such a positive use of the platform that we have.
So is that the theory of change, in a sense, that by celebrating these practices that are doing well, it sort of feeds into the wider industry?
I mean, I'd say that, we look firstly to thinkers like Donella Meadows and, thinking in systems and leverage points. So fundamentally, Arkitekter Declare is looking at how do we change the goals of the system, the paradigm. So that's really about the worldview. And it's only when the worldview is correctly aligned does everything beneath that align towards a more regenerative future.
Yeah.
And one of the higher points within Donella Meadows' 12 points is that you should change the goals of the system. And that's actually where the first conversations came around, is what do we consider the avant-garde today in architecture, and how can we shift that? And, the award schemes, what are the things that we're striving towards as architects and celebrating? And actually, we really want to celebrate a way of practicing as opposed to an outcome as a built project.
Gotcha, yeah.
And, this is, again, the index is looking both at projects and at organizations. I think we iterate it's not just architecture practices. It could be any organization that is contributing to the built environment. But it's... the goal of the system really is the point there.
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to change, because we want people to aspire towards this and set the new vision.
Yeah.
On top of Donella Meadows' thinking that we've referred to many times, something that we've always kind of referred to is the 3 horizons model. So Horizon 1 being the practice that we see most commonplace today. Horizon 3 is sort of the vision of what we want to achieve. And Horizon 2 are the transitional actions and practice that we're seeing to help us step from Horizon 1 to Horizon 3?
Horizon 2 are the kind of the bridging ideas or the transition ideas, and these are the technologies we have today that are useful in the transition to a lower carbon and more regenerative society, but they will effectively die out over time. And Horizon 3 are the things that we don't really have around today, but show glimpses of a future which is more sustainable and more regenerative. So using those three horizons is a really useful explainer on YouTube about the Three Horizons framework. Once you get into that mindset, it's quite useful to understand, okay, what is this project doing? What is this initiative doing? What are these ideas doing? Are they Horizon 1? Are they kind of old school things we kind of want to get rid of eventually? Are they Horizon 2, possibly, like electric cars or other things? Or are they Horizon 3, like entirely new ways of relating to each other? And so that's an interesting framework that we've tried to represent in the logo, and hopefully people pick up on that as they see it.
Yeah, I think that's the Three Horizons is great because I think it makes clear, I think, something that is a really challenging conversation within, I suppose, sustainability at the moment, which is that lots of people have a conceptualization of a sustainable future as being broadly very similar to how we are now, but just with renewable energy and electric cars and solar panels and that kind of thing. And it's having that more challenging conversation, saying, actually, a lot of things probably should be much different, and even in ways we can't imagine yet. And so I love the idea of building the bridge, to that world that we don't know necessarily what it is yet.
And back to the technology point, I mean, we can have this sort of wizard or prophet way of looking at it. And if we still have all the wizardry of technology, but under the goals of the system that's still in a paradigm of endless growth and profit, then it's not going to be serving in everyone's best interest. So we have to kind of set the vision, being this Horizon 3. The new mindset is sort of what we're aiming towards. And then there's a transition to kind of steward the technology and all the innovation that's happening towards that horizon, and not become degenerative as it is now.
Yeah, and there's a lot of work being done around positive, like social tipping points, where once you get a critical mass of people who have adopted, we'll say in this case, regenerative practices, the sort of lagging majority will then all of a sudden come along, hopefully. So you're trying to push against that tipping point, and hopefully it just becomes normal in time. Yeah.
And I think it's not, we can do as much we can to push and drive change, but we also need to work to bring down the barriers towards change. It's a dual approach that we're taking throughout. Yeah.
I'm thinking about how you're sort of clicking into other people and other people I've had on the podcast who are again taking quite a systemic approach. I'm thinking about people who are working in universities and trying to change the narrative in universities about what the goal of an architectural education should be. And the way that architecture fits in with wider urban systems and all that kind of thing. Other people are working on those. So I think it's been a really fascinating thread for me over the years doing the podcast of, well, first of all, how often Donella Meadows is mentioned as like such an influential thinker on the sustainability transition or whatever. So yeah, I mean, really fascinating.
And on that, we've got, we do have a theory of change within Arkitekter, which it's probably on its 17th iteration at this point. It doesn't come up enough, but it's good to have a chance to discuss it. And I guess Annalisa is correct that this is really about changing the goals of the system within the industry. That's we'd say about 30 or 40% of our work at the moment. So we do work within the profession, which is about changing those goals within the profession. But we also have a more significant piece of work, which is about shifting external organisations and actually going out and advocating on behalf of the built environment for the change we need to see in legislation and policy, because there's a limited amount we can do within the industry, but actually we know that if we can change organisations outside that, that's going to be more of our focus. So if you're interested in kind of policy change, we're doing work called Building Blocks at the moment, which is about the 3 policy levers for the next British government to make sure that we are really able as built environment professionals to do good on our word and to do good on the declaration with the support from policy and funding that we need to do so that it's not entirely up to us to make this change.
Absolutely. I mean, it's architecture is a really important part of the jigsaw puzzle, but it's only one piece. And I think really we have to be looking at things like the planning system and the way our economy is so enmeshed with housing delivery and all of these various things which are really complex, like wicked problems, but they're so essential to getting to where we know we need to be.
And often contradictory, right? We have a regulatory system that contradicts often planning system goals. And that's why we speak about the kind of the systems goal. You know, that all has to align for all of these building blocks that are fitting in underneath to be aligned towards that higher goal.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm sure you have a sense of where regenerative design is at in the industry at the moment. And what are your thoughts on that? I mean, it's been incredible to me following it just the last 2 or 3 years, really. It has just started popping up everywhere this term. And I think there's concerns that it might become another buzzword or it might be misused or that it might be misinterpreted in different ways. So I suppose, I'd be interested to know, as you guys are in it, working in it day to day, how is it in the industry at the moment?
I do think that's something that we speak about a lot and are really conscious of, is that we have to hold on to the essence of what it really means. And that's why I started by saying it's a mindset. Yeah. But at the same time, it is something that is measurable. Like, we can measure that we are net positive on energy, for example, and we can measure what the biodiversity impact or the embedded biodiversity of materials as much as we can with this kind of quite current carbon tunnel vision that we have. So I think it's about making sure that we have a very holistic understanding that goes beyond sustainability. It's not about doing less bad as sustainability is, but it's about this kind of positive net good. It is measurable, although those measures need to be evolving to understand that regenerative design will evolve over time. We are kind of concerned, as I guess anybody is, that we'll just kind of have this new greenwashing with regenerative washing. But I think safeguarding the term, and partly what the work that we're trying to do with the index, is to create a common language, as with the design primer that has also been recently launched. By having a common language and a common understanding of these terms, it allows us to speak the same language and to set the same targets and to be working to the same goals, and hopefully have a very industry defined standard, as we're starting to see around things like net zero or net zero carbon or carbon positive. These industry standard terms are becoming acknowledged now.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's a real risk that it is co-opted and becomes somewhat meaningless, and we're fully aware of that, as Annalisa suggests. I think we do need a better paradigm and a new word, though, and I think we recognise that, and that's why we're sort of. And also, I suppose, to my point earlier, this is not a new concept. It's new to the built environment in terms of the lexicon that people are using, but it has been proven since the sort of late 80s that this is one of the things we need to achieve as a society more broadly, and it's inspired by nature, which has obviously been doing its thing for an awful long time. And I suppose one of the ways that we're trying to protect this and make this a meaningful initiative is to invite some really important ambassadors. So we've got 3 ambassadors who will be joining us for the judging of the index, and I'm not sure if I can announce who they are at the moment. Isabel's in charge of that and when that'll happen. But there's one ambassador for each of the 3 categories that we have. One for the being a good ancestor, one for co-evolving with nature, and one for creating a just space for people. And I think I certainly really trust those people myself to help steward this and make sure that it is actually a meaningful recognition of people's work.
Amazing. Is this? I think it's probably a good time to get on and talk about some of those criteria and those questions, because I think there's loads to get into there, and that will sort of help us unpack what this means. I have, I suppose, bits of it that I'm interested in, but I'd be interested to know from each of you, what are the criteria or the questions that you think really speak to you, that you feel are really important?
Yeah, sure. I think, for me personally, I think co-evolving with nature is a really interesting one, a bit harder to grapple with. I'd first speak to being a good ancestor, and I think that's quite something that is easier to relate to and easier to get stakeholders on board with in the idea of, because there's all sorts of tools. There's the Long Time project that have a whole set of tools that were referenced in the first iteration of the Arkitekter Clear Practice Guide, which is great because they give these ways of thinking both back several generations and forward several generations in timescales of people that you can relate to, whether it be grandparents or children or children's children. And then you can start to understand what is your legacy and what legacy do you want to leave. And that changes the way that you start to approach a project. So I think that's quite a tangible one that we can think about. I'll let you speak first, Alisdair, before we go into co-evolving nature.
Yeah, I'm really excited about all the criteria, really. I think it's because of the breadth of subjects that we've managed to fit into this, I think it gives most practices a chance to shine. Particularly for me being a good ancestor and having kind of clearly stated purpose and ambition within the practice is important. And we see a lot of that nowadays. And I think it's understanding those ideas, whether it's having a theory of change or whether it's having a clear succession plan or being an employee-owned trust. I think those kind of things are important, especially as we're potentially going into a recession at the moment. This is not just good sense in terms of Arkitekter declare and this kind of work, it's also good business sense. So I think these things will help practices show what they've been doing and how they've been thinking about the future a little bit more. I think creating a just space for people is also super important because social sustainability is very almost inherent to a lot of designers' work. A lot of the built environment professionals are much better, to be honest, at thinking about people because you can really sort of empathise with people. We all can. Whereas I think that, you know, as Annalisa says, we've had carbon tunnel vision for a little while, and I think talking about just space for people and regenerative design is important nowadays. So I'm looking also forward to seeing hopefully some of the younger collectives and practices applying and telling us about their work, engaging community work, because there's so much great work going on. I hope we get a chance to shine the light on it.
Amazing, yeah. I suppose before we move on to the co-evolving nature piece, I'd be interested to know what are some of the aspects of projects that you think could be exemplary in these, in terms of being a good ancestor or the making space for people?
I think with the good ancestor stuff, it's about resilience at this point because the climate is changing and there's recognition of that. So I think where projects can show that they are actually, whether it's designed for disassembly or whether it's something that's actually got a shorter design life or a longer design life than it was originally intended, I think challenging those ideas about design life are certainly an important thing that we'd love to see, and sort of this idea that solutions can be slightly less deterministic because we know enough to know that we have to have flexibility in our future designs.
I would add to that about kind of resource use. For example, you know, we have to look both at geographically distanced boundaries from our site, but also time distance boundaries from our site, and think that what are we borrowing from the future and building today? And, you know, with the project I'm working on in Wales is really sitting under the Future Generations Act. And, you know, there's some really empowering decisions that have been made in Wales in infrastructure based on the idea that is this actually in the best interest of the future generations over the interest of our needs today.
And in terms of creating a space, just space for people, I'm reading that upside down from your page.
Well done. I think that's really, like I say, that's really just about deep engagement with the local stakeholders on projects. And I think it's really what we do ask, and you'll notice this in some of the questions if you're applying, that we ask that kind of, you know, do a majority of your projects represent this? So it's great that practices have some standalone projects, but it's kind of, is this standard in your practice to go out and do that engagement, to ask those neighbours or those stakeholders about their views and ambitions for the building? Because we know that buildings where there's been a deeper engagement with the local society are generally more resilient because people care about them and they were involved in their, you know, in their co-creation. So that's one of the things we'd be looking for. And I think then we also do talk about kind of social value, and that's a metric that's kind of come about in since about 2012, I think, was the Social Value Act, and this idea that actually we can measure the social impact of architecture. And I think that is a useful term and a useful thing alongside regenerative architecture to think about what is the social value you're generating, because going that extra mile, whether it's doing the engagement or doing the post-occupancy work or doing something that's kind of either side of the architectural process that's not necessarily paid so well, I think that shows benefits, and thankfully things like social value actually can monetize that benefit. That's really another discussion whether you should monetize social value, but nonetheless it's in there as a metric in this category about just space for people.
It's such a tricky thing because I think, like, as designers, you know, we work within, you know, systems and an economy that we don't necessarily have much influence over, and I think one of the things that I find so tricky to grapple with is the fact that you can do an amazing project that's very sustainable and you can involve local people, but once it sort of hits the market, you have those ripple effects of gentrification perhaps, or pricing people out, or you sort of have to work within a developer model that you don't think is actually particularly good for local people and that kind of thing. So I do feel for practices who will obviously take the work they can get and not always feel like they can influence that side of things.
Yeah.
I think in general, though, you know, we would also advocate that we need to expand our agency. And where are the places where we can get involved as early up the chain in a project as possible to make sure those kind of management, stewardship, long-term involvement and community control over a place is going to have legacy as well.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's an element about self-organization there as well. You know, people who know a place best are going to make the place most resilient because they know what's needed there. And how do you build up that resilience through the means by which the project comes about? And it's not just kind of coming in as a designer and then, you know, doing your community engagement and being away with it. But I think really building up a long and iterative way of designing that you're constantly feeding back and having a longer term involvement with place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there really needs to be a mindset shift in terms of how much meaningful community engagement and co-creation is always money well spent in terms of the outcome of the project. Because I've really seen that working in consultancy for local authorities, where their budgets got so stretched that the community engagement side of thing just became so minimal for many projects. And they said, can you just do it, you know, as cheaply as possible, really? And you just can't get the data that you need in terms of, you know, what makes the place tick to do the projects with that sort of mindset.
Yeah, there's a real risk to tokenism in that issue in consultation, but thankfully there are now, you know, there's certainly been quite a few celebrated examples of deep engagement on projects over the last sort of decade, and they've been awarded various, you know, the largest architecture prizes. So it's good to see that recognition. I think there is a sort of a tidal shift towards that recognition. There's also some stories of those same projects which are now, you know, coming under pressures from capital. There are reasons why some of those projects aren't as successful as they were when they completed. But that is the context that we're in, and like I say, we have to be kind of ambitious despite the current systems.
Yeah. Well, let's have a chat about the co-evolving with nature piece, because I'm very interested in this. So yeah, tell us a little bit about this one.
I mean, to your earlier question about kind of what resonates with you, I said this really resonates with me. I think partly because as part of my role in Arkitekter and as one representative along with a colleague on the steering group, I've been taking part in a regenerative policy course that's led by Oliver Broadbent, who also wrote The Regenerative Structural Engineer.
Okay.
Plug on Oliver's behalf. What we speak about there is co-evolving with nature coming under 3 categories. And for me, this has really helped kind of grapple what that is. And it's understanding interconnectedness, firstly. You know, we need to have interconnectedness within a system. So we as humans need to understand how we are interconnected with natural systems. And through that create feedback loops. So you can understand where the stresses are from what one activity is doing on another part of the system and how you can change that to make sure that you are co-benefiting. You know, you see that with kind of trees in the forest through mycelium networks, and if one tree is scarce of water, they can actually communicate that and share the water load between them. Secondly is symbiosis, so really designing out waste. And I mean, that is an example, but you know, within natural ecosystem there is no waste. The output from one becomes a resource to another. So really seeing how do we work in symbiosis, reciprocity, you know, how do we work with nature so that both can thrive?
Yeah.
Robin Wall Kimmerer gives great examples of that in Breeding Sweetgrass. I'm sure many people would have
Love that
read.
book.
Yeah. And then coming back to this point about self-organization and evolving systems that are best fit to a context. And, you know, there's this kind of messiness in nature, and there's a self-organizing element. There's no one steer about how anything should operate, but things evolve that suit a context. And that's why we need to trust local communities. It comes back to this previous conversation about what is best for that local context with the local knowledge.
That's so interesting. I mean, these are quite like lofty concepts, I think, that probably designers are not used to grappling with, I imagine.
I guess, Alisdair, maybe it's best to speak a bit more how that relates to the Regenerative Architecture Index and the sort of things we might expect out of practices and projects.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that was very eloquent, Annalisa, and I didn't know about those, you know, that work you've been doing, so it's fascinating. I've got a simpler approach to it, which is from the 2021 Dasgupta review, which is we are part of nature, not separate from it. And that fundamental description, we try and write the work that we've done in the RAI and other places, with part of nature not separate from it, and it's worth that reminder. And that doesn't have to be so lofty. It can just be the case of in our practice recently, we start having meetings outside. We find that when we're walking forwards together in nature, we tend to make better decisions when we're sitting opposite each other in a meeting room. Why that is, who knows? There's evidence that, the brain is less stressed out in nature. There's lots of research to back those kind of things up. But that's a simple decision. It doesn't take a lot of resources. It doesn't take a lot of effort. You have to have an umbrella and avoid busy times of day, certainly. But, it can be very practical. So those kind of things, as well as just having plants in the office, using biophilia in your design, these kind of ideas aren't too complex, but I think they're worth recognising and grasping upon as a good idea. So those are the kind of the practice criteria. And then within the project criteria, we've got the useful kind of buzz at the moment around biodiversity net gain. So by including this as a requirement, what we're finding is that there's just far more discussion about it. It's a hard metric to prove, and it's a difficult sort of learning curve for a lot of people, but I 100% support it because it just means that people have to take a little bit more consideration about what they do with that empty site.
Yeah, I mean the biodiversity net gain in the UK is might be one of the first examples of what you might call a regenerative policy coming into national legislation, and I think it's fantastic in concept. And I think from what I've heard talking to landscape architects and practitioners, it is very tricky to make it work in practice the way we maybe want it to work. But I think hopefully with refinement we can get there to it being a really good thing. I have a couple of questions rolling around in my head. I'm wondering where to go with this. I suppose something that I find interesting is that I suppose within a sort of a room like this where you have people, we're sort of, educated professionals, and we, live and breathe this stuff, and we love, thinking about these things, and we want to move things forward. And I think often when you bring it out into the public sphere, or you talk to people who from totally different backgrounds, their heads are in totally different places. They're thinking about things like, how am I going to pay my rent? Where are my kids going to live? There's no affordable housing around. Just day to day, the crises that we're living in, I suppose, day to day. And do you think there's a role for the architect or the built environment professional as also kind of an educator when we're interacting with people, when we're doing that sort of engagement, to sort of show that other possibilities are out there?
Absolutely. And I think my first point would be that we do use simpler language when you're, in broader discussion than this. And I think the importance, the differentials between sustainability and regenerative design and other terms is something we'll discuss within the profession. I don't think we should necessarily force that down people's throats in consultation, but what we should really be doing is passing them agency. Okay. Because it's their built environment, it's not our built environment, and it's very much about passing agency to take care of places and to care to landscapes, and these are all things that people fundamentally agree with. Once you get on the right terms and on the right language, and it's the difficult thing at the moment, obviously, is as people are under such pressure with the cost of living crisis and many other crises that are intersecting at the moment, it's how you find time for those discussions and those meaningful discussions, and that's not an easy thing. I certainly don't have an answer to that.
I think it's also about communicating co-benefits of a lot of the things that we're talking about. We talk about healthy homes and well-insulated homes to reduce our energy consumption, but it also reduces fuel costs. And, that can help towards energy security for people. Or if we talk about the types of materials that we're using, are we going to be using petrochemical-based materials, or are we using natural bio-based materials that also promote health and well-being in X, Y, and Z way, reducing pollution in our streets? All of these kind of co-benefits that people can relate to, how it's going to personally impact them, and then explaining, and not just explaining, but kind of discussing with people how they would like to shape the future of their place and what these co-benefits they would like to see. And then how does that translate back to what we're designing and how we deliver that? Yeah.
There is a kind of a certain magic that can happen when you get in a room with people, and it's sort of a well structured, and it's a good discussion, I think, with local people. Because I remember I did some engagement work a couple of years ago where it was a community typical thing, council office community thing. We brought people around tables and we were doing a sort of interactive consultation around stuff that was happening in the town centre. And there was a guy who came with the explicit sort of message that he didn't want any private vehicles being limited from the town centre. Because I think he got wind that they were going to, be promoting cycling and maybe pedestrianising some streets and that kind of thing. And he was saying, like, you have to think about people who, are older, people who need vehicles to get in and out and all that kind of thing. He's making some good points. And there was another guy there who was an avid cyclist. And he was talking about how awful the town was for cycling and that he always feels like he's in danger and he needs, it needs proper cycle lanes and all this kind of stuff. And the two of them were sort of ended up having this sort of conversation within the group. And by the end of it, the guy who was quite, we'll say pro vehicle, pro car at the beginning, he said, you know what, when I was a kid around here, we all used to cycle our bikes everywhere. And he said, I realized that actually kids these days can't do that because it's too dangerous. And he sort of had this mental switch, not from us like trying to educate him, but just from chatting to one of his like another local person who had a different perspective. And that for me was evidence of like when you can facilitate the space for people that is sort of judgment free, these little magic switches can happen, which is really nice.
Exactly, that's a lovely example. Yeah. Sorry, Emily. Sort of, there is polarization in the media and in the debate at the moment about broadly about net zero sustainability, the low carbon mission, and so it's important to bring people together because there is evidence that citizens' assemblies do overwhelmingly vote in favour of sustainable policies when brought together and given the time to consider carefully the options open to us at this stage. So I think there's got to be more room for that. Like I say in my previous responses, if we can't create those spaces for people to discuss and debate these ideas together, it can become very problematic if the debate happens mostly online and is driven by media with interests that may not be clear.
Yeah. Well, I think this was partly why we wanted to partner. And, what was spoken about within Arkitekter Clare is the responsibility of the media and both addressing that and making sure that they are promoting the urgency of the climate crisis that we're in a kind of frequent and transparent way. But something made me think, I was speaking on a panel at Future Build, and there was a really difficult question that came out of the audience, and it made everyone on the panel really sit and think. And what was my real takeaway from that, which I'm so grateful for, was the importance of putting ourselves into the points of view and into very challenging perspectives of other people and making sure that we're not just sitting and having these conversations in silos, because you will always change your frame of mind when you have a conversation with somebody else. Yeah. And it's important that we're constantly navigating that. And, if we continue to think that we want to drive a certain message, it's how do you then communicate that message in a way that can bring more people on board? But I think stepping out of our silos and as much as possible putting ourselves into those contradictory, challenging conversations is really beneficial, even if they're quite difficult in the moment.
Yeah, it can be painful for your ego, but it's. I think if you can have the right mindset around it and be open to it, it is great to talk to people you disagree with because have to get out of your echo chambers.
Yeah, and I think we have to practice more empathy as a profession, and this has been coming up with some of the changes happening with the Architecture Registration Board and some of the work they're doing. That they've found through some research that a lot of the public expect built environment professionals to show empathy in all situations, and so unpicking that word and why that came up so regularly in the research is something that's kind of happening at the moment. But I think it's really important to remember.
That's interesting. Yeah. Let's talk about the Regenerative Architecture Primer. What is that? What's it about?
Okay, so annoyingly, it's called the Regenerative Design Primer, and it doesn't totally overlap. We should have not called the Regenerative Architecture Index the Architecture Index because it's not just for architects, and the Regenerative Design Primer that is aimed at architects and other designers is also incorrectly named. But I think this is basically a way of us making the principles of regenerative design more accessible, firstly. Okay. So it's kind of setting out what do we mean, what we've spoken about at the beginning by regenerative design. It's nothing new. And this is how we, as Arkitekter Clare, are describing it under these three categories. I think I also mentioned that it's about making a common language and making sure that we are working towards the same outputs and defining a vision. I think what it does quite well, And we hope that the Regenerative Architecture Index will feed into this in future iterations, not generations, is that today we see traits of regenerative design, even if not a whole project is regenerative. So it gives examples of some of these traits, and where we collect data from the index, we can include those into the next iterations. And then finally, it provides practical steps and tools for those who want to follow the guidance to reach some of the declaration points and the points of the regenerative design. So it is structured around the RIBA plan of work. It first sets out, much like the Arkitekter practice guide that came out in 2021, firstly, we need to put our house in order as an organization. So first, you need to start to adopt the mindsets that we've been speaking about within the organization, because that's going to drive how we practice. And then it goes through the RIBA work stages with guidance and tools of how you may think differently or approach these work stages differently. And then, gives a set of guidance going through.
Interesting. I think, is that available now?
That is available now. It is a constant draft. It's always going to be a work in progress.
That's great.
So there are parts in it that say, do you know what, we actually don't have an image for this right now. Hopefully by next year we will. If you've got some ideas, email us at this address. But I think it's in the understanding that, we don't hold all the answers, and we're really hoping that this whole process will bring the industry together to work open source, collectively share data, and allow us to kind of build as much information into this as possible.
That's great. Yeah. Well, I'll have a link to that in the episode description so people can go to that. And I'm looking forward to reading that as well, because I think something that is so needed is those examples and those case studies, because I think that makes it really concrete for people, or decidedly not concrete, but, makes it real
Tangible.
for people. Tangible, exactly. Of like what this looks like in practice, basically. So that's brilliant.
Yeah, there's been there's long been a challenge within Arkitekter about which projects to showcase and how to decide what gets attention, given that we know a lot of things are flawed in some ways despite being great in others. We've had back and forth within the steering group, and I'm a keen advocate of certain projects. I talk about and it's concrete. It's the Seedveld in Svalbard in Norway, which for me represents in some way a regenerative design, because it is storing things for infinitely future generations, and it is protecting nature in a way that very few buildings do. But arguably it's got a huge carbon footprint. So how does that square? Also, the Eden project, I think, did an incredible job of regenerating a Cornish clay mine. So there are, lots of positives in that project. And then sort of more recent projects, looking at Nest House by Studio Bark, was a very engaging project with a number of students who learnt and built that project for a couple who were, really in need. And I think it's an amazing project.
I suppose an important point for me as a non-architect is that I suppose it doesn't have to end with the building. And I think, you talked about, a couple of examples there that aren't your typical sort of building projects. And I think also embracing the landscape architecture aspects of these, the urbanism, the neighborhood design, master planning is so important. And actually, I think the lines between these are often quite blurry anyway. So I'm presuming, even though we've been talking about architecture, actually, this is all relevant to other. Yeah,
absolutely. And we'd welcome projects from a number of different built environment professionals. And, it's really about looking at that holistic picture and saying what was the ecosystem that allowed this project to happen. And there'll be, hundreds of people involved in many projects. So we really want to see what those stories are and showcase them, because it doesn't, it's not simple to design in a regenerative way, and it does require buy-in from a lot of different team members. So we'd also like to hear stories of when, other consultants have got involved and advocated on behalf of the team.
I mean, when we were first talking about the index, we were thinking, could we award this to non-human organizations? Like, I know you've had a previous episode on beavers coming into Parkland in West London. And just to stress the point, it's really not about architects or even built environment professionals. It could be community groups. It could be anyone who basically hears about it and thinks that they have something to contribute. You don't need to have an answer to all of the questions under every category. There are many firms who have been working forever their entire existence in incredibly positive ways. And there are some who, perhaps large firms, who basically put all of their energy into selling the one regenerative project that they've been doing, but actually they're disguising a load of other bread and butter stuff that they're doing behind the scenes. So this is why we are going to sort of separate it out under the categories, and it will almost be the frequency by which you're able to respond to things across the board is an indication of a practice's breadth and depth of regenerative thinking. But this won't be presented in a linear index ranked way. But there will be some. We're going to kind of form a compendium of, as we said, this kind of best in class projects that we see today and practice that we see today. Those will be named and celebrated, but there will be a whole list of organizations who have entered into the index who will be grouped under the categories.
It's then a place to go where people who are looking for collaborators or for architects to work with, it's a kind of a destination to go to where you then have it sort of in one place.
Yeah, I definitely hope so.
Yeah, it should be a resource that we can continue to build on, and it should be a place where you can find value-aligned designers or, other people.
Amazing. So it's submissions are open now until sort of mid-May, isn't that right? And then what happens after that?
After the 17th of May, we will be taking some time to review all of the work together with the ambassadors and identify the, really the best in class for the 3 different categories, as well as the best in class for each of the different questions.
Yeah.
Oh, and that's the point. Actually, we are going to be assessing it question by question, which is why, it's not about if you only answer 5 out of the 19 questions. If you only answer 5 out of the 19 questions, you're not penalised anyway. Okay. It's just that for each question, we're trying to gather the best answers for that question.
Gotcha,
And then that will kind of get put forwards into the index. After the ambassadors and the kind of announcement of what the index and this compendium looks like, we will be having a celebration event in September. More information from that to come, but we're hoping it's going to be a really good party and sort of an anti-awards dinner, which, working on.
There will be a theme. We're still figuring that one out.
And then finally, there will be a away weekend. Have we announced that's at Schumacher College, probably?
Yes. So that'll be at Schumacher College down in Devon, where a lot of this thinking happened. In the early days, and a lot of the education there is really aligned with the work we're doing. So that'll be an away weekend for people who've entered the index, and it should be a real celebration of their work and a space to learn more and exchange ideas with others.
And I think we're going to see it as a real workshopping for feeding information and data into the next iteration of the Regenerative Design Primer, which is where the whole loop then loops and completes.
Well, and you're building a community around it as well, which is really exciting. There's probably going to be people who've never met each other that are doing really,
hopefully we can sort of feed into some of the knowledge communities that exist around this work and strengthen them and build them.
So will it, just so I'm interested how it evolves into the future, are you reopening it for submission every year, or how does that work?
Absolutely. The intention is it runs annually, and like Annalisa says, it builds on the successes of the previous years. We'll definitely be tweaking the questions, definitely be tweaking the way it's judged. A lot of the different things that we'll learn from the first year, I think we'll see evolution, but hopefully it retains its spirit and grows year on year.
Amazing, guys. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I think we'll call it there unless there's any final points.
Great. No, thanks very much, Ross. Really enjoyed the chat.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having us and giving us the opportunity to speak a bit more about the Regenerative Architecture Index. I know that we've had quite a few questions coming in from people who are hesitant about applying. So just to really iterate again, we really encourage that everybody applies. It's for everyone, not just architects. The more data we have, the more successful it's going to be. And we're really looking forward to seeing the outcomes. And then hopefully we can have someone from the team on one of your later podcasts to kind of feedback some of our learnings from it.
Yeah, definitely good to have a part 2, and we'll see where it's gotten to, definitely.
Great. Thanks a lot, Ross.
Thank you so much.